Greetings, Idaho. My name's Teresa Roth, and I'm associated with a group called Ion Elections that is working to make elections more secure by making them less computerized. My background is in electronics and software engineering, and it turns out that is very helpful for understanding how high-tech election fraud actually works. I've been researching political issues related to the abuse of electronics for several years, and I've covered such topics as smart cities, surveillance, and digital identification. But I've been researching electronic fraud relating to elections lately, and it's a huge topic. In this video, I'm going to try to explain how electronic tabulators work in a way that non-technical people can understand. I'm going to try to stick to the basics and point out exactly where the main problems lie. And I think that when normal people come to understand how easy it is for sophisticated, high-tech bad actors to rig elections, they will be horrified. There's a lot of problems with our elections to unravel, and we can't do it all at once. We're just going to start with tabulators. So we're going to start off at sort of a high level just by philosophically pointing out a few reasons why it's a terrible idea to trust computers to run our elections. First of all, the people who really understand how computers work, not at a user level, but in terms of people who understand the microprocessors and operating systems and, hardware behind all these systems, they all totally understand that these systems are completely hackable and that they all have backdoors and they all have passcodes that are known to very high level people. Now, it doesn't mean that these systems can be hacked by the man on the street. What it means is that there's, obviously, like for example, in the case of the election technology companies who actually create tabulators and poll books and so forth, the people who design those systems and write that software absolutely 100% know the backdoors and the passcodes and the special ways to access it. So they're not secure. They're absolutely not secure. And everybody who really understands the way electronics works knows that. Um, the other problem that's really philosophical, though, is we've just, there's nothing about an election from registering a voter to voting to counting a vote that is rocket science or really needs a computer. Yet we have, over the last 20 or 30 years, added layer upon layer upon layer of computerized complexity to our election system to the point now that it is run entirely by high-tech gurus. And that is just wrong. I mean, we need to own our elections. They need to be accessible. They need to be understandable. And if you don't understand how your vote is being counted, that is just wrong on the face of it. And the last thing to point out is that these people who are developing these systems are not our elected officials and they are not accountable to the people. All of these election technology companies are private corporations. But even more surprising is a whole lot of the things you think are done by the government, like supposedly the the Department of Homeland Security is supposedly monitoring our, internets, our government internets to make sure there's no cyber attacks. Well, they're not. They contract all that out to private contractors and NGOs. I mean, the whole elections, our elections from top to bottom, are being run by corporations, and these are not necessarily good corporations. So now we're going to talk about types of computer election fraud. And just before I even go over this, this is not even a complete list. The real problem, well, there's a lot of problems, but a big problem with the whole topic of electronic election fraud is it isn't just that there's tabulator fraud or voting machine fraud or voter roll fraud as separate things. It's that they're all connected. There's there's a whole level of other software programs above this. Like, for example, there's election software in the Secretary of State's office that facilitates, electronic registrations, that facilitates election night reporting. And there's other software that controls internets or intranets within the state system that can be spied on and can be manipulated. So this is, you're not even seeing the whole gigantic network of computerized fraud, but these are basically the main components that, as a voter you would have access to, and almost the entire rest of the presentation tonight, we're just going to be talking about tabulator fraud, and tabulator fraud is catastrophic. It's a terrible form of fraud, and it's very dangerous, and yet it is not the only type of fraud. And I think in another video, I'll visit other types of fraud and I'll kind of explain gradually how this whole network works together. But this is, like I said, this is just a list of the types of voter fraud that, the average man in the street can kind of get their head around. So now I'm going to talk about tabulators and exactly how they work and explain why the way they are architected, that is the combining of the scanning or photocopying of the ballots and the tabulation of the results, by combining those two functions into a single machine, you are creating huge problems. Those are two functions that should not be combined. So the tabulator first takes the ballot, it scans it and makes a digital image. There is then software that reads the digital image of the ballot and calculates the results from that image. And then there's other software that tabulates all those results. So what you get as digital output from the scanner is both the official digital images and the tabulated results. And those will always match. That is, the digital images and the tabulated results will always match. The trouble is, and this is where horrendously undetectable fraud can come in, is that because the part of the tabulator that it does the scanning and photocopying is hooked up to a computer, it has the capability of falsifying the ballot images. Once it's falsified the ballot images, the official ballot images, which match the results, no longer reflect what was actually on the ballots, and there is no systematic way of always checking. Especially for large elections. This is never checked. The physical ballots are never read by any human, and they are never compared to the ballot images in a one-by-one way for large elections. They do logic and accuracy testing, which is a very small controlled test, and they can do spot checks, which are also very small controlled checks, and those always come out right, and then the tabulator says it's working fine, and nobody ever looks at the ballots again. So the potential for fraud here is absolutely enormous, and these tabulators it's a terrible form of fraud. It's very dangerous. It's very hard to detect. And in order to challenge this, you try to do a recount, but the recount doesn't even allow you to do what would be needed, which would be a one-to-one check of the ballot images with the scan results. That is not how a recount works. We'll talk about that later. But machine fraud can be unlimited. Even if you have a problem with absentee fraud, and it's very skewed to one side, that is only maybe 20% of the ballots. A tabulator can falsify any and all ballots, including the absentee ballots. So it could be that the skew that sometimes we're seeing on absentee ballots, which are extreme and sort of unbelievable, could be inserted by the tabulator, and it could be not absentee fraud going on at all at the personal level. These might be real voters, but they're results are being systematically skewed. So it's a very, very dangerous form of fraud. And most people associated with elections want you to look at anything but the tabulators. They want, go ahead and look at absentee, try and find bad um, voters, worry about whether or not all voters are legitimate or whether we've got illegals voting. Look at anything except the tabulators, but the tabulators really are the center of the problem. So what, may you ask, would an honest tabulation system look like? It's really very simple. The first thing we need to do is exactly what we talked about before. Split the process of photocopying the ballots, generating valid, secure ballot images, and making those ballot images public. That has to happen before tabulation should even begin. Once valid, secure images are in public view, which should be which using a regular document scanner could be put on the internet within an hour after the polls close, because these document scanners can scan 30 pages per minute. It should be very easy to get this data up there. Once valid images, which we know cannot have been tampered with, are up and viewable by the public, it makes fraud almost impossible to occur. After that, and if fraud does occur, it will almost certainly be discovered. So that's the key thing. In terms of how the results get tabulated after the digital ballot images are put up, um, right now, the only two systems that Idaho allows to do official tabulation by machine are ESS and HART, and those can accurately count ballots, but they can also be programmed to cheat. So if we're short-circuiting their ability to cheat, they should be able to produce legitimate results. We recommend hand counting because we think that we want as many eyes on these ballots as possible. And another thing in the future is a tabulation system that reads electronic images and of ballots and can produce tabulated results from those. Should be so simple that it can be run on a laptop and may even be an open source type tabulation system. No such thing exists at this time, but it could easily be created. So in the long term, there should be no need for any proprietary hardware or software to run elections. It should all be 100% transparent. We don't even need these electronic technology companies that are actually running our elections right now. So we're talking about how tabulators can cheat, and now we want to look at whether or not there's actually evidence of machine fraud in Idaho. As a matter of fact, there actually is. This came up in the November 2024 election, and this is kind of what started me down this path of a deep dive into election fraud. But anyway, I've already written articles on this incident and have made 2 videos. So I'm not going to spend very much time on it right now. Just basically, there was 2 separate, completely impossibly unlikely statistical anomalies. One was the initial reports reported just a few hours out of the after the polls closed matched the final results exactly for just those 3 races. This is not even unlikely. This is completely impossible. It can't happen, but it would be a signature of fraud because, the way the fraud algorithms work, they use set points. So that just is very unlikely. It was very unusual to find something like that. And the other is statistically, the election day voting was way below the early voting for all these 3 races, much more than any other race. And again, this should not have happened with such a large percentage of early voting. But the point is, I've already covered these. I have 2 videos that can be found on the Eye of Election page. Resources, there's a video resources page. The first video, which really walks you through it, kind of gives a big, broad overview and explains what the statistical anomalies are and how they sort of fit into the whole, algorithm of fraud issue. I also made a second video so that I could kind of push detailed analysis just about statistics and kind of walk through the statistic for people who really don't understand statistics very well. The other thing that's in the second video is, of course, lots of people said, oh, no, there's an explanation for this. There's an explanation for this. And I just needed to rebut because, a lot of people who don't want to face up to machine fraud will say anything to try and excuse very difficult things to explain, and that happened here. Anyway, so that's all we're gonna cover for the proof of machine fraud here. I'd be very happy for you to look it up. I want to get to other issues, especially very important to the reaction of the Idaho political establishment to proof of machine fraud. It's quite disturbing. So what I really want to talk about instead of the details of the fraud is what happened when I tried to expose the fraud, because I think that's going to give you some insights into just exactly how hot a potato of a topic machine fraud is. I knew before I presented anything that this was very unusual to find proof. And I knew it would be controversial, and I knew that a lot of people would not want to hear this. So I checked and I double checked. I did not want to present any evidence that I wasn't sure of. I didn't want I wanted to look for any possible other explanation myself, so that if people, came and said, well, what, could it be this? Could it be this? I would have already looked into it. And I really did my research and I made charts. I looked at data all the way down to the precinct level, and I wrote everything into an article. There was a lot of things that bothered me about the election, even before I found all this fraud. It was just irregular in certain ways. So I wrote an article and I wrote emails detailing the problems. 10 days after an election, there is the Board of Commissioners votes to certify the election. This is very important because before an election is certified, if you have problems with it, it's pretty easy to get them changed and looked into and fixed or addressed. After the election is certified, that's why there's a 10-day delay. After the election is certified, it's legally extremely different. It's a total uphill battle to get anything changed once the election is certified. So I knew I had very strong evidence. I wrote a letter to everyone on the Board of County Commissioners, the clerk, and all of the leaders of KCRCC and the candidates. And I also attended the canvassing meeting, which is where it gets certified, and I spoke before they certified the election and asked them to please look into these issues and please delay the certification. And they did not only did they not look into it and not delay the certification, nobody asked any questions, nobody acknowledged the problem, nobody did any follow up. It was absolute total stonewalling silence. Nobody had anything to say about this, and I sort of already knew this because I'd already sort of talked to people, and this is just not a topic that anybody wanted to talk about. So, true confessions, I did sort of know that they weren't going to certify the election because I knew how big of a political problem it would be and how much pressure everybody was on. The powers that be in Boise and wherever else they are absolutely under no circumstance wanted to look into this or delay the certification. Um, so I think that the political pressure was way too much to resist, and to their, on their side, very likely, even if you've read my articles, you would not have enough knowledge to answer the questions and resist the criticisms that you would face if you were to stand up to the gale force winds of people who really, really, really want that election certified and really want to bury this issue as quickly as possible. So I'm not, I was disappointed in the political reaction, but I wasn't surprised. But at that point, really everybody wanted me to shut up and go away. And they did not want to address these and they didn't want to answer. And as far as they were concerned, it was over. Um, and so I was told, as excuses by people who refuse to deal with this, if you suspect fraud, why don't you request a recount? Um, the machines have been tested and certified. It's past logic and accuracy. We have already proven that machines were accurate before we ran the ballots, so we know that we don't have a problem. If you think a crime has been committed, contact the DA. And if fraud occurred, why aren't there more people complaining? So those are sort of the, excuses for ignoring fraud. So I'm going to sort of go over some of those excuses and see why these are very lame excuses and we really need to not ignore the fraud. I think there's a pretty wide misconception about what a recount actually does for a race that was run on an electronic tabulator. And I think that the lack of understanding of what the laws governing recounts are is what makes a lot of people assume that if I had been serious about these allegations, I would have done a recount. The reason I didn't request a recount is because I read the recount laws and I knew that a recount would be absolutely worthless. It would be worse than worthless because it would 100% guaranteed to match the original outcome, and it would prove nothing. Because the key about what's in Idaho law is that there's two types of recounts. If the original election was hand counted, as it is in a lot of small counties, that, if you have a very small county, you just count by hand, you don't bother with a central tabulator. In the large cities that have central tabulators, any race that is counted by a tabulator must be recounted with the same tabulator, with the same individuals doing it. So there's absolutely nothing different. What they do for window dressing is they have you hand count 5% of the votes and then specifically use those 5% just to verify that the tabulator is working. Well, we know that the tabulator has the capability of counting votes correctly, so that's going to pass. And at that point, you're just going to retabulate um, all the same errors that you had before, because if the um, tabulator has been programmed to cheat, it is still programmed to cheat. And there is no way to determine this unless you're given access to the actual ballots. And there is nothing in the recount procedure that gives you access to the ballots. So the physical ballots are very strictly controlled, and the recounts do absolutely less than nothing. They're completely worthless. Okay, so as it turns out, this is from a news report that is only a few weeks old. This is information from a 2022 election, and what happened in that election was that a candidate for an office looked at the results from the primary and noticed that there was 0 votes recorded for her in her own precinct where she and her husband had voted. So that was proof enough that there was something funny going on to get the county clerk's attention. But of course, since he was following recount procedures, which are probably very similar to Idaho, he did the recount um, just as he had, following recount procedures. And it produced the exact same results. So, fully knowing well that she had voted in this precinct and her vote was not being counted, um, that was enough standing for her to get a legal order to force a hand recount. And when they did a hand recount of this election, over 2 years after it occurred, they found out that she had actually gotten 4,000 votes, and 3,000 of them had been deprived of her. Some of them had been given to one of her opponents, and another 1,800 of them had just been denied. So this is positive proof that exactly what these conspiracy theorists think are happening is happening, which is the tabulators are programmed to cheat, and they just changed ballots and there's nobody checking them. That's exactly what we're saying, and that's exactly what we're seeing. So if you now realize that recounts are completely worthless, certifications are completely worthless as well. All certification does is show that a machine that has been designed to count ballots is able to count ballots. That is literally all it does. It does nothing to prove that they cannot be tampered with, and it doesn't even try. It takes almost the approach as if, well, if there's any errors, they're accidents, and then we're not going to certify. It doesn't make any real attempt to it can't. There's no way you can certify a computer can't be hacked, because as we have said, all computers can be hacked. So it's completely worthless, and it's just a fig leaf that provides false confidence to voters. And then this, when I posted here, is just the scope of certification, which just lays it all right there in black and white, that the certification is doing nothing, and that a certification is not an endorsement or a warranty or a determination that the voting system will be operated in a way that is within election law. So it's completely worthless. It's just mind-boggling that anybody falls for this stuff. So last but not least is there's a couple people, including somebody who used to be a pretty good friend, who every time I mention fraud says, if you think a crime was committed, call the district attorney. Um, as if that's going to shut me up. I don't think so. Anyway, but of course, all I've proven is that cheat software appears to have operated in an election in a certain time. And as I've sort of explained before, the cheat software is on the computer, system. And we don't know who put it on there, even though we might even know who actually installed installed the updates. Um, we don't know if the person who installed the updates knew what was on the disk that they were installing. We don't know. We don't know who wrote the software. We don't know where or when they wrote it. We don't know under whose direction. And we're positive whoever they were was not in Idaho. And even though I'm pretty sure, from my dealings with people since pointing this out, that there's several people in Kootenai County who are aware of the tabulator fraud and probably have known about it all along. I will not try to identify those people, but to the best of my knowledge, even if I did, as far as I know, it's not a felony to know that election fraud is happening and not report it. It's highly unethical, but it's not a felony. So there's nobody to arrest. There's nothing to do. There's no legal action to take. And so I'm not being remiss in not doing a recount. I'm not being remiss in not buying into the certification BS. And I'm not being remiss in not getting anybody arrested. There's nobody to arrest to my knowledge. So after the fraudulent elections were certified, with the approval of basically the entire Kootenai County political establishment, I decided to change tactics. Obviously, it was no longer fruitful to pursue this because, as I said, once the election's certified, it's just a horrendous legal battle to get anything done. So what could be done constructively, I thought, was to more or less drop the criticisms of past and really try and work constructively for the future. And what I came out suggesting in some of these tabulator articles that I wrote was just very, without bringing up old issues, explain what the problems with tabulators were and offer a constructive solution, which I think we described in an early slide, which is basically just at every precinct scan all the ballots on a standalone scanner immediately out of the ballot box, and then however they can be counted manually on the central tabulator, ideally on, just a portable laptop-based tabulator at some point. But the point is, the real reform to avoid fraud and make fraud impossible or at least very easy to catch if anybody does do it is to use a about $350 off-the-shelf scanner and scan every ballot. So that is what I have been proposing. Uh, Idaho's political establishment, I've been trying to be positive and not bring up the past and make suggestions, and they are, uniform stonewall. Nobody will deal with election fraud seriously. Nobody will deal with tabulators or acknowledge things. Even people who claim to be very committed to election integrity. Election integrity people want to do something besides fix the tabulators. I believe that tabulator fraud is the kryptonite of the deep state. And if you take it away, or excuse me, if you expose it, it is Armageddon for the deep state. I believe tabulator fraud is sort of the linchpin that's holding the entire corrupt political establishment together, and they are not going to give it up. And the reason I know that is because I now know what's planned for Kootenai County, and it's something I think we all need to resist. So it sounds like the way that Kootenai County is planning to solve its problem with its fraudulent central tabulator is to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars on 74 precinct tabulators, all of which have the exact same inherent problems with its architecture and software that the central tabulator had. So they're going to buy them from a different company and it's going to be a different configuration, but it's going to have the exact same problems. Now, I am getting mixed signals about how much this is going to cost, but it's going to be a minimum of, 5,000 each, and all of these need maintenance and software updates and storage. It's an absolute nightmare, and it's going to make things no better at all. So, even Reagan in his article infers that he knows that these tabulators are hackable because the method that he's going to use to assure voters is he's going to have all of the precincts tabulate their results on their precinct tabulators, and then he's going to run the ballots through the central tabulator at the elections office and compare the results of the potentially fraudulent central tabulator to the potentially fraudulent precinct tabulators. And he says it would be highly unlikely that you could tamper with two systems and get the same results. But this is absolutely false, and he should absolutely know this. The way these elections get tampered is with algorithms. The algorithms are going to run exactly the same on one tabulator as another. I mean, they don't have to, but they certainly could. So if you run the software on your Apple, it runs exactly the same as it will on your Microsoft. The underlying hardware is different, but the results are the same. So you are not highly unlikely to get to two different results if you tamper with the systems. You're guaranteed to get the same result. This is exactly what's going on with the recounts. You recount with the same machine and you get the same result. So this solves absolutely nothing at an enormous cost and a much simpler, much less expensive, much more transparent way to actually produce ballot images that are made with a simple camera that is not hooked up to a computer and can't falsify ballot images, is easily available at a much cheaper cost. So this doesn't make any sense to me, and I don't understand why somebody who was dedicated to honest elections would even suggest such a thing.